She wasn't a thing to trade for a rifle, and she wasn't afraid anymore. Out on that wind-scoured land, where the only trace of those who came before was a lopsided chair left under a creaking porch, Elijah lived quietly, like a man who had already gone. One day a girl was left beneath the shadow of a pine, a scrap of paper in her hand, swollen eyes. He didn't ask her name. He just opened the gate and let her in. That land didn't have a name on any map. The wind passed through it the way it passed through unmarked graves no one bothered to light a candle for. Even the grass bent westward, toward where the sun always sank, like some confession never fully spoken. Elijah's cabin lay at the foot of a low hill, not tall enough to be a mountain, but enough to block the light each evening. The house was built from old timber, resting atop cracked brown rock. The roof was corrugated tin, one corner torn off by the wind. There were 2 wooden chairs on the porch. One had rotted nearly through. No one sat in the other. Elijah lived there, alone. No one came asking. No one saw him off. Folks in town half remembered he'd been a soldier. Some said he once cooked for a general. Others swore he was the fastest shot south of the river, before his hands started trembling after he lost a child. But they only whispered these things when he wasn't near, because Elijah didn't talk to anyone, and no one had the courage anymore to knock on that door. Each morning he rose before the sky had made up its mind, when light was still just a thin promise. He built a fire from dry kindling he split himself, boiled water in a dented black iron kettle. On the wooden table were 2 old ceramic mugs. One had a chip at the rim, the other he filled with tea each day, but never drank. He never looked at that cup, but whenever he sat, his hand always rested near it, like a habit, or maybe a signal to someone who never came back. In the stable were 2 aging horses, Grit and Molly. Elijah brushed them each morning without words, without reins, only his weathered hands repeating a motion done 1,000 times, a ritual to keep himself from breaking. He fed them roasted corn and salt, same as he ate, and spoke to them in fragments only he understood. East wind this morning, might rain. You remember that smell before lightning hit? He used to ride you all around the yard, laughed the whole time. They say time heals, but to Elijah, time was only how pain learned to sit still. He didn't kneel before God. But once, an old preacher recalled, Elijah stood outside the church through an entire Christmas service, stood in the snow, bareheaded, never went in, just stood there, then walked away. No one asked why. They were afraid the silence might hurt worse than the answer. On his windowsill sat a picture frame, turned inward. The glass was thick with dust, but a handprint still smudged the surface, like someone used to wipe it clean every day, or like Elijah still touched it when it rained, or when a distant whinny stirred a ghost too stubborn to leave. He didn't cry, but he had one strange habit. Every time he baked cornbread, he made 2 servings, one to eat, the other left on the table beside that untouched cup of tea. That afternoon the sky burned soft yellow, the kind that comes in June when dust rises like the smoke from old gunpowder. Elijah sat on the porch. The chair to his left was empty. Grit dozed with her head low. Molly stared at the horizon. A breeze moved through the pine, a small shadow, no clear shape yet, paused by the weathered fence. Elijah didn't turn, but his hand, unseen, slid the teacup just a little closer to his chest. Night fell quickly on that land, as if even the sun had grown weary, eager to retreat without lingering a second more. The wind creaked through the tin roof. Windows moaning with each breath, nature exhaled. Elijah stoked the fire. The flames lit half his face, one side still and quiet, the other worn thin with years. He didn't eat supper, just made tea, pour 2 cups, as he always did. The next morning came clouded. The sky hung low, gray threads dangling from the rim of heaven. Molly let out a soft whinny, like she knew something was different. Elijah didn't hurry. He pulled on his boots, soles patched 3 times, shrugged into a worn military coat, and carried a small tin of water. As he passed the fence, he saw her, a girl, maybe 13, sitting with her back against the southern pine. She didn't cry, but her eyes were swollen. She clutched a crumpled scrap of paper. Her clothes were dusty, streaked with pine sap. The heel of her shoe had come apart. The wind blew, tangling her hair. But she didn't bow her head. Elijah stood there a while. She didn't look up. He stepped closer, said nothing, just touched the edge of the paper in her hand. The writing, shaky and in pencil, read, "Pa said wait here. If he used to be a soldier, he'd understand." That was all. No name, no plea, no asking permission. Elijah read it, folded the paper, and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat. He turned and walked away, slow. Each step pressed into the earth with a soft groan, like memories exhaling beneath old boots. He gave no sign, no word, only nudged open the warped wooden gate with one hand. No sound, no lock. Then he went back inside. Half an hour later, when he returned to the stable, the girl was standing inside the yard. She said nothing, asked nothing, but her eyes now pointed downward. Her arms were folded across her belly, not from cold, but as if to hold herself together. Elijah tossed her a pair of small brown gloves, old but still warm. They didn't quite fit, but they kept her hands from bleeding. She took them, no thanks, and he didn't need one. That evening Elijah made baked beans, same as usual. He set out 2 wooden spoons, one large, one small. No one spoke of there being 2 people in the house. The girl ate in silence, small bites, slow. Elijah poured tea, not a full cup, just enough to warm the soul. She held the cup in both hands, trembling but steady. She didn't spill. He looked out the window, not at her, didn't need to. Outside, the wind still moved, but inside the cabin the stove breathed little red embers, like a heart relit after a long winter sleep. After supper, Elijah stacked straw in the storage room. He laid out an old ash-gray wool blanket, once his daughter's. The girl said nothing, but her eyes met his. In that moment, time seemed to pause between 2 people who no longer had childhoods, no longer had places to return to. He turned away, closed the door to the shed, and for the first time in years, he slid the bolt across, not to lock, but just to keep the wind from coming too hard that night. At dawn, he left a piece of cornbread on the windowsill and a pair of thick wool socks. No note, no message, but the smell of bread drifted across the yard with the breeze, and inside the house that hadn't yet warmed, something had begun to melt, slowly, quietly. No one knocked. But someone had stepped in. Morning didn't begin with the sun in that land. It began with the light flap of crows descending from the pine to the water trough, with the creak of rusted chains on the stable doors, with the soft breath of the earth after a night colder than usual. June, the girl who had yet to speak her name, was up before the day turned gold. She didn't knock, didn't speak. She simply curled beside the shed stove, hugging her knees, eyes fixed on her torn shoes, still stained with pine resin, red dust, and threads unraveling at the sole. Elijah saw, but didn't stare. He brought out a small wooden box, hadn't opened it in years. Inside were several pairs of old boots, most worn to the heel, all softened by time. Only one pair remained intact. Sun-darkened leather, faint embroidery dulled by the years. He placed the boots outside the shed door. Didn't explain, didn't look at her. but his hand, the one that had carried them, clenched faintly as if tugging on a memory not yet laid to rest. June stepped out and saw the boots. She knelt, her hands still trembling, touched the leather, paused. Her eyes didn't blink, but no tears fell. She tried them on. They fit perfectly, as if the boots had been waiting for this pair of feet, though the first person to wear them had long left this world. That day, Elijah taught with his hands. He showed her how to latch a door with one hand, in case the other was holding a wound. How to strike flint for fire, no matches allowed. How to push open a wind-tight door without spooking a horse. June never asked why. She simply nodded, remembered, and did each thing right the first time. Elijah didn't praise her, but that morning he brewed tea and for the first time served it to her. The chipped mug, the one he usually used, was set before June. He drank from the other. By afternoon the wind picked up. Clouds rolled in like a herd of panting bison. Elijah handed her a coat, old, thick, sleeves short. June took it, put it on, didn't reach her wrists, but enough to keep the cold off. She stood by the stable, spreading hay for the first time with her own hands. Grit chewed slowly. Molly nudged her shoulder, unafraid. From a distance, Elijah watched. He said nothing, but his fingers brushed a crack on the porch railing, the spot where his daughter once carved her name. The carving had faded now, but Elijah never sanded it smooth. He left it there, proof that whoever had once lived here had never truly left. That night it rained. The sound of rain on the tin roof echoed like the knock of someone long gone returning home. Elijah sat beside the stove, setting a pot of beans to simmer. The scent filled the cabin, wove itself into the firewood smoke, and somehow the old house felt smaller, as if someone else now shared its walls. June brought out a small bowl of beans, ladled it herself, set it in front of him, didn't ask, didn't look. Elijah bent, lifted the spoon, tasted slowly, then set it down and looked up, for the first time meeting her eyes. "Next time," he said, slow and even, "ease up on the salt." She didn't reply, but the corner of her mouth tilted. Not quite a smile, but no longer fear. It was the first time Elijah had spoken since the day she arrived. Over 2 weeks passed, and the first time June was called family. Not in words, but in the simple act of being gently corrected. That night, Elijah opened the window by the stove, let the wind and rain come in. On the table, 2 spoons lay neatly, one large, one small. One had been used. The other, for the first time, was put away, because it didn't need to be left out anymore. Night didn't fall fully in that land. The moon was veiled by a thin sheet of cloud, casting over the ranch yard a dusted silver light, like time itself had settled into the cracks of the earth. In the stable, the 2 horses slept standing. In the shed, June lay curled toward the door, arms wrapped around an old blanket, not for warmth, but as if hoping to hold whatever memory still clung to its threads. The cabin wasn't locked. The wind still came in, but the smell of last night's bean stew and cornbread hadn't yet faded. It clung to the walls, seeped between the floorboards, as if the house itself was trying to hold on to something fragile. At dawn, before even the rooster stirred, June was up. She lit the stove in the side kitchen, a chore Elijah usually saved for himself. The fire burned low, green-flamed, but steady. She scrubbed pots with sand, wiped the table with a scrap of an old shirt she'd found in the shed, and set out 2 bowls, unprompted, unspoken. Elijah entered. He looked over her shoulder, said nothing, but when he lifted the kettle, he tilted it to fill both cups. "Tea's weaker today," he said. June didn't answer, but something in her eyes had dissolved, like salt melting into boiling water. The day passed through small things, gathering dry grass from the hill's back, washing the old saddle, patching a coat with pale brown thread, learning to split firewood without it snapping back against her leg. Elijah gave no words, only gestures. A nod here, a look there. June understood. She learned by watching, and through a silence filled not with fear, but with gratefulness that hadn't yet found its voice. At midday they shared cold rice and black beans. Elijah cut an apple in half, giving her the larger slice. June didn't refuse, but with a small knife she cut a piece off hers, enough to make it even. Not from manners, but because she knew a man like Elijah didn't give from pity. By afternoon, the air had turned cold. June hauled more firewood into the cabin, stacking it neatly by the stove. Elijah stepped into the yard. He stood in silence, looking westward, toward the slope where his daughter once rode horses in the golden hour, her hair flying like wild grass, her laughter still ringing in his memory like a far-off bell. June saw, but didn't ask. She stood there, holding the last piece of wood, waiting for Elijah to return so she'd know where to set it down. He turned back, pointed to the southern wall, the one that caught the most sun each day. She placed the wood there, then, for the first time, sat beside him near the stove. They didn't face each other, only watched the fire. The flame popped and crackled, ash drifting upward like memories rising, only to fall again inside each of them. June handed Elijah a bowl of beans, this time with a few slices of onion. He took it, tasted, nodded once. "Don't add anything more, that's just right." A plain sentence, but to June it was something more. It was acceptance, quiet and clear. She didn't have to beg to stay. She didn't have to earn her place with reasons. She took off her boots, stepped barefoot to the door. On the wooden step she sat, lifted her face to the sky, eyes half closed. The wind moved through her hair, curled into the cabin, made the fire flicker. Elijah rose, brought a blanket, laid it over her shoulders, said nothing, then returned to his seat. For the first time in years he felt the cabin wasn't just a shelter. It had become something else. Not a place where someone had returned, but a place where something had a reason. Since that night, June no longer slept in the shed. She didn't step into the back room either, the one Elijah hadn't opened in years. But she began clearing a corner of the porch, laying down thin wood planks, setting up an old cloth screen to change behind, spreading her wool blanket across a long bench. That spot caught morning sun and heard the ranch breathe at night. June rose even earlier now. She stoked the fire while the sky was still blue dark, set breakfast, one portion for herself, the other for Elijah. Each item placed precisely as if it had always been so. The wooden spoon laid sideways, the teacup angled just right for a right hand to reach. No one instructed her. No one spoke it aloud, but every morning when Elijah stepped outside, everything was already waiting. Simple, rough-hewn, yet it felt like something had been expected. One day, while sweeping the porch, June bent to pick up a flat stone, wider than her palm, its face smoothed like it had been worn down by river water over years. She took the old pocket knife Elijah had given her the day before and carved into the stone. She wasn't good with letters. The words were crooked, uneven, but deep, pressed with care. If anyone's ever been left behind, this place isn't finished yet. She placed the stone at the porch step, where anyone passing by could see it. Didn't hide it, didn't explain. Elijah passed by later that afternoon. He didn't touch it, just looked, and his eyes lingered longest on the line. This place isn't finished yet. That evening Elijah didn't eat with June. He went into the back room. The door creaked faintly, like the breath of someone still alive in memory. He lit the oil lamp with a trembling hand. On the table sat a photo frame, thick with dust. He wiped it with his sleeve. The cloth drew back the ears, revealing the face beneath. A girl, about 13. Sunlit hair, eyes squinting in the brightness, riding Grit, who was now old and slow. His daughter. She had never grown older than that day. Elijah sat, held the frame in both hands. Didn't cry, just closed his eyes. Outside, June scrubbed dishes in a wooden basin. The water bit into her skin, but her hands didn't tremble. She glanced toward the window, where a faint glow spilled from the back room. For the first time she saw light from that place, and she understood. Something had begun to open. That night, as wind rose, the small stone out front did not move. It held fast, solid like a soul that once meant to leave, but stayed for someone who'd never asked aloud. June stepped outside again. She added a single daisy, white, small, and beside it, not for decoration, but as a whisper to anyone who'd once been unable to return. We're still living here. The next morning, Elijah placed a folded cloth on the breakfast table. Laid atop it was an old, faded photograph of his and a daughter. June paused. Her hand stopped mid-motion. She loved horses, he said, like you do. Just that, nothing more. June lowered her head. Her fingers brushed the edge of the photo frame, then pulled back. I wasn't trying to replace anyone, she murmured. Her voice was barely air. Elijah nodded. No one replaces anyone, but everybody needs someone, just to make staying possible. Nothing else was said, but in that moment, between an old man with no child left and a girl with no one left at all, something had been rebuilt from old ash. Not family, not love, not yet, just a place to return to, if you no longer had anywhere else to go. That morning the north wind came early, dry and raw like sand slipping through fingers. Carried no dew, no scent of grass. Only a hiss, like a dull blade scraping memory, a whisper that the past is never truly shut. Elijah rose before dawn, a sharp ache beneath the collar of his worn leather coat. He donned his wide-brimmed hat and walked along the eastern fence, a stretch he rarely checked. The wood was rotted, nails rusted, a few slats missing altogether. Beneath one broken plank he saw it, an old carving nearly rubbed away by time. I'll be back in spring. No name, no date. But Elijah knew who'd carved it, and he knew the spring that came, only ashes returned. He didn't come in for breakfast. June laid out 2 plates, but only she sat. She cut the cornbread in half, placing one piece to the side, as if someone might still reach for it. She didn't go looking for him, just stared out the window where fog swallowed the hill beyond the grass. Elijah sat on the slope behind the house where the horizon could be seen clear, and the patch of land that had swallowed his daughter 3 years ago. She died while he was still enlisted, guarding an armory far away. A bolt of lightning struck a dead pine. The roof collapsed. Wife and child didn't make it out. The news came late. When he returned, all that remained was a charred wall, cold ash, and a singed edge of cloth, buried in dirt. That day, a crow from the distant town arrived, a scrap of paper tied to its leg, a note from the priest, saying someone had come asking about the girl under the pine. Elijah gripped the paper, his hand clenched the soil, then he let it fall, a late apology in the wind. His hand trembled, not from age, but from memory breaking open, quiet as stone splitting beneath rain. June stepped out, holding a pair of freshly washed wool gloves. She saw him on the hill, said nothing. She placed the gloves on the stone step, then turned away. Elijah didn't look back, but his hand curled inward, like it meant to hold on to something already pulling away. That night he didn't light the lamp. The house drowned in shadow. Wind passed through the wooden walls, the roof, and through every crack he had never patched, because he needed them. To remember his daughter's laughter down the slope, to remember the words, "Come back soon, Pa," unanswered, to remember the empty chair he still left on the porch every time he brewed tea, and to live with the question he'd never dared speak: if I'd come back one day sooner, would it have changed anything? June slept under the awning, the wind sharper than any night before. She pulled tight the wool scarf Elijah had given her last week and felt the cold he bore. A wind no one else could see. She stepped out into the yard, under a moon thin as a blade. She walked to the cabin wall where his boot prints pressed deep. She sat there, didn't speak, didn't carve anything more, because some griefs only ask for someone to remain. No words needed. Winter came early, no snow yet, but the frost whitened the earth from first light. Wind swept through the valley, made the pine branches scream, not like a song, but like a warning from the land itself. It would show no softness, not even for the kind-hearted. June was gathering dry wood when she saw it, a cloud of dust rising from the main road. No one had passed that way in over a year, except for the monthly supplier and a few coyotes nosing through the trash at night. A man on horseback, not young, not in a rush, but his hand never strayed far from the pistol on his hip. He wore a brown leather coat, low-slung hat, gray beard, and eyes as still as water trapped in an old trough. Elijah was cutting rope behind the stable when he heard the hooves. He didn't lift his head, just said loud enough for June to hear, "Stand to the left of the cabin. If he stops, don't ask anything." The man reined in, tied off his horse, gave a slight nod. No name offered, just handed over a red-stamped paper and a small canvas pouch. "From town," he said. "Someone reported a girl named June once lived in Newfield. Her father, Abel Rook, wanted for theft from the military armory. Might circle back. Looking for the girl." He said it straight, then waited. Elijah read the paper. His face didn't change. "And," he asked, "we're not here to arrest, just to notify and warn." The man looked toward the porch. "If he shows up, what'll you do?" Elijah's eyes followed the man's toward the shaded awning, where June stood still as a shadow. "The door'll be locked," Elijah said. "Locked with what?" the man asked, a half-smile in his voice, but it didn't reach warmth. "With me." Elijah said it like granite breaking. The man thought on it, then nodded. "We don't rewrite reports. No one saw anything, heard anything. If that's how you want it." Elijah didn't nod, didn't refuse. He just pulled a scrap of paper from his coat, scribbled something, folded it, and handed it over. "If anyone asks, give 'em this." When the horse vanished past the trees, Elijah sat on the porch steps. June didn't speak, but her eyes held the same frost as morning. "Will my father come back?" she asked, quiet. First time she'd asked about him. Elijah didn't answer right away. He took off his boots, placed them by the door, wiped the mud with the back of his sleeve. Then he looked at her and said, slow, "Not everyone comes back out of love. Some come back looking for what they once thought was theirs." June nodded. She sat beside him, hands gripping the hem of her coat. "If that's the case, I don't want to be something someone owns." Elijah stood, went inside. When he returned, he carried 3 thick planks, nails, and a hammer. He began reinforcing the inner door, a door he'd only ever latched lightly until now. Each strike of the hammer sounded like a promise, rough, unadorned, and final. June watched, didn't ask, didn't help. She just stayed there. No one said, "I'll protect you." No one said, You belong here. But from the moment Elijah drove that first nail, and June did not turn away, something was laid down between them, not spoken, but permanent, like snow that falls and never melts, in the hearts of those who've lost too much. That night the wind calmed more than it had in weeks. The cabin door was barred with 3 heavy beams, not out of fear, but because someone inside was worth keeping safe. That morning fog poured over the valley as if a great hand had drawn a curtain across the land. Every edge disappeared. The barn, the fence, the slanted roofline, all softened into silence. Only the warm breath of the old horse grit and the slow drip of water from a cracked wooden trough remained to prove the world was still turning. Elijah sat at the wooden kitchen table. No tea brewed, no fire lit. In front of him, a blank sheet of paper, old, yellowing, but unused, and a black ink pen. He wrote with his left hand, the letters plain and crooked, each line carved as if into wood. The girl stays here. If anyone asks, tell them no one ever came. No name, no return address, nothing left behind but a decision, simple in shape, heavy as an entire life of unspoken things. He sealed the note in an envelope and handed it to the morning delivery boy, a skinny, quiet lad who rarely spoke more than needed. "Send it down to the town office," Elijah said. "Tell them it's from me, but don't put any name on it." The boy nodded, didn't ask a thing. When he left, Elijah returned inside, reached under the table for an old revolver. He didn't load it, only dusted it off, and handed it to June. Her eyes widened. "I don't know how to use it." Elijah nodded. "It's not for shooting, it's for not being afraid." She took it. Her hands were small, the weight of the gun shifted slightly in her palm. He said, "If someone comes to the cabin, you hold it. But only look, don't raise it, don't fire. If you know you're meant to stay, you won't need to look dangerous." June stared at the gun like it was a secret. She slipped it into the inside pocket of her coat, near the heart. That day, Elijah showed her how to latch the bolt from inside, how to unfasten a bridle in one move, how to tie a knot that holds a horse without choking it. He didn't preach, didn't say, "When danger comes, do this." He simply pointed, nodded, and let her learn. June caught on fast, didn't smile, didn't joke, but her eyes stopped darting to the corners. And some afternoons she walked the ranch on her own, not calling Elijah every time the wind blew. On the last night of the month, the wind held still, as if the sky itself had paused. The moon wasn't full, but bright, like melted wax spilling across the dirt yard. June sat on the steps, wrapped in a coat too big for her, sewing a split seam in the second pair of wool gloves Elijah had given her. She mended not out of need, but because something inside her whispered, "This deserves to be whole." Elijah stood behind her, not close. June spoke, not turning. "If you hadn't opened the door that day, I think I would have stayed under that pine, until the wind took me." He answered, after a long silence, "Someone once told me children left behind don't need to be asked why. They just need to live first." No more was said, but in that quiet moment, no sermons, no saving, just 2 people who'd once been scattered by wind, now holding shut a door. Not to keep anything out, but to hold in something neither had known before. Peace. Night fell. The nails hammered into yesterday's door still marked the wood like scars of loyalty, and June, gun held close to her chest, slept on the porch like someone no longer left out in the cold. A week after the letter was sent, the western wind changed. It carried the scent of burnt field and rotting root, a signal that weather was turning and something old was on its way back. June lit the stove beneath the hearth, hands hidden in a pair of wool gloves worn through at the fingertips. Elijah checked the ropes. eyes trailing the tree line. The same place he once saw his daughter, golden hair flying, laughing from the saddle, waving at him from across the yard. He'd never spoken of that memory, but it lay in him like a blade lodged deep and long. That night the sound came, not wolves, not wind. The steady tread of hooves, slow, deliberate, the kind of pace meant to be heard. The gate wasn't locked. Elijah never locked it with iron, only with the weight of his gaze. The man emerged in broken moonlight, beard wild, eyes red like a cornered animal. Abel Rook, the man who'd left June with nothing but a scribbled note, letting the wind carry off the rest of his duty. He returned not to make amends, but to settle a debt. He dismounted, didn't tie his horse, bottle of whiskey half gone in one hand. His voice was hoarse, but he didn't shout. "June, I know you're here. Come out, I need you." June trembled, her hand wrapped around the pistol in her coat, clinging to the only truth she had. Elijah rested a hand on the wooden bar across the door. The cabin was quiet as an old man waiting for a tired predator to walk away. Abel kept talking, voice slipping. "I need you, so they'll leave me be. They think I still got you. If not, I'm done for." He gripped the fence, eyes dropping to the dirt. For a second, his tone faltered, like he was whispering to himself, "I didn't want to leave you that day. I just never knew how to be a father. Never did." June stepped out from behind the cabin, holding a lantern. Its soft yellow light touched her face. Thin, sharp, no longer afraid. Elijah made to stop her, but his hand paused at the doorframe. She stood in the yard where the moon hadn't reached. She didn't raise the pistol, just held the lamp. Their eyes met. The pine branches rustled behind them, like the voices of the dead stirring low. Abel faltered. Maybe because of the light, maybe because the girl standing there was no longer the child he'd abandoned. "Come with me, June. You're my daughter." She shook her head, said nothing. Abel looked around, waiting for someone to force her back. But there was only the cabin wall, the ropes, and the post that bore a carved line. "June stays here." He turned his horse, gripped the reins, looked back once, not in anger, but like a man who'd just lost something he never learned how to keep. The hoofbeats faded, not like a victor riding off, but like a man leaving behind a piece of regret under the cold moon. Elijah stepped outside, stood beside June. Neither spoke. The wind kicked up, again lifting dust from old ground. "Sound kanait," but this time no one felt the chill. June stood there for a long while after the hoofbeats faded into the hills. The oil lamp in her hand still burned, its flame swaying in the wind. Like a heart kindled again after a long winter. Elijah said nothing. He simply placed a hand on her shoulder, light as a pine bough settling across a tired child's back. No one spoke of what had just happened, because sometimes silence is the only way to preserve the dignity of someone who's just reclaimed it. She stepped into the cabin, the lamp still in hand, her eyes dry. Elijah closed the door behind her and slid the bolt, not out of fear, but because now this home held someone who needed rest. The next morning the sky cleared. The wind turned warm, strange, and soft, as if even the land understood. Something had been put down and no one needed to lift it again. June headed out early to the stable, fumbling slightly as she fastened the saddle. Elijah watched her from the window slat. There was something in the way she stood, no longer a child left behind, but a person choosing where she belonged. That morning they ate cornbread. June poured the tea for Elijah, her hand no longer trembling. He took a sip and nodded. She asked, "Do you think, he'll come back?" Elijah didn't answer right away. He sliced a piece of bread, handed it to her, then said, "I don't know, but some men only return when they still believe they have ownership. Yesterday you didn't let him believe that." June nodded, said nothing more. But in that nod was a quiet farewell to a chapter where she had once been something passed from hand to hand. That afternoon, June took the revolver from her coat pocket and placed it on the kitchen table. She wiped it clean with her sleeve and said, "I don't need to carry it anymore. Not because nothing might happen, but because I know no one's going to treat me like I don't matter." Elijah looked at the gun, then at her. He nodded. "No one keeps you here. You stayed because you chose to." She bowed her head, not in gratitude, but like a vow that this place no longer required hiding. That evening, light rain began to fall. Elijah sat by the window watching the pine outside the porch. June sat near the stove, stitching the frayed edge of her old coat. No one asked, "What are we to each other now?" Because there was no need. The one who was once considered a bargaining chip was now someone kept, not for any condition, but by kindness. And the old soldier who once brewed tea for someone who never returned no longer had to do so alone. That night the wooden cabin held two kinds of warmth, one from the fire, the other from a peace that now had a name. That morning sunlight spilled across the porch of the cabin, soft as warm water rinsing the crown of a freshly washed head. The wind passed through, not biting, just enough to stir the window pane that creaked each evening like an old bone remembering. Elijah lit the stove early. He broke pieces of cornbread into a skillet, drizzled in the last spoonful of molasses from the jar. Not for anyone, not expecting praise. He just wanted breakfast to carry a gentler scent today, the way even sunlight slipping through the cracks in the old wood window had learned a slower patience. June was washing the horse. Her 13-year-old hands were rough now, fingernails pressed with clay, sleeves soaked dark, as if she'd been doing this all her life. No one told her to. No one watched. But when Elijah stepped out onto the porch, the stable felt lived in again, not like the place that had once echoed with emptiness. He glanced toward the broken post behind the stable, the one his daughter used to loop the training rope around when learning to ride. It had leaned crooked since last winter when the wind tore the roof loose. He'd never gotten around to fixing it. Until that morning, Elijah fetched the axe, split a length of dry pine. June helped drag the rope, held the new post steady in the damp earth. No one gave orders, no one asked what needed doing. But somehow everything moved together, as if the ranch itself, with all its silences and stubborn habits, had taken its first breath after a long forgotten season. When it stood straight again, Elijah rested the axe against the tree, wiped his hands on his trousers, and said, "This place needs a few things straightened." June didn't answer. She pulled from her coat pocket a charred piece of coal, something she'd tucked away the night before, and began to write on the new post. Each stroke trembled, each line carved itself deep into the grain. "June stays here." No one told her to. No one stopped her. Elijah read the words. He nodded, not as approval, but because something in him had finally been spoken without needing a voice. That afternoon, Elijah brought out an old coat, coarse gray fabric, once worn by his daughter. He handed it to June. No explanation. She put it on. The sleeves fell past her fingers. No one altered them, because she wore it like someone carrying forward what another had not been able to finish. The old timber cabin still sat beneath the shadow of the mountain, changed little. But now, on the porch, two pairs of shoes sat side by side, one small, one large, both wet from the rain, both drying beneath the same stretch of sun, and behind the stable stood a straight post with a line etched by a hand that had once trembled, but no longer hid. "June stays here." Not taught, not ordered, just chosen, and carved deep enough to last. Spring came without announcement. The west never bloomed, only green whispered through the brown hills, and the sky stopped cracking at the seams. One Sunday morning, June combed her hair with her fingers, dressed in a rough-spun garment patched from 2 older shirts, and followed Elijah down to the town church. It had been a long time since he'd gone, not for lack of faith, but because he believed God wouldn't begrudge a man trying to live right, even if he didn't kneel every week. The town watched them as strangers, 2 silhouettes unfamiliar. Elijah offered no explanations. June lowered no gaze. They walked, quiet and steady, through eyes too startled to form a name. The chapel was small, low ceiling, long wooden pews, a scent of aged pine mixed with the lingering musk of saddle leather. June sat beside Elijah in the last row, her hands rested loosely on her knees, eyes meeting no one, but never hiding. The preacher spoke of the prodigal welcomed home. No one looked directly at them until after the service ended, when an old woman, white-haired, cane in one hand, stepped close, her eyes narrowed in curiosity. "What are you to that girl, Elijah?" she asked, not bitter, just the honest question of a Western soul, where every bond ought to have a name, a bloodline, a ledger to trace. Elijah looked toward June. She was tying a ribbon back into her hair, head down, not listening. Or maybe listening in the way that matters more. He replied, slow, certain, as if answering not just the woman, but all the unspoken questions no one had yet dared give voice to. "She doesn't have to go anymore, that's enough." The woman paused, then gave a soft nod, the kind only someone who's lived long enough to know. Not everyone born to you is family, and some are kept by a kind of kindness no name can hold. On the way home, June didn't ask anything. She walked beside Elijah, her boots stepping in the dusty wheel tracks along the road. The wind carried the scent of musk, dry grass, and burnt wood. She glanced toward him and murmured, "What will folks think if you're not anything to me?" Elijah didn't turn. He only smiled, that half-smile he once gave his daughter when she nearly fell from the saddle but pretended she hadn't. "If they've ever been left behind," he said, "they'll understand." That afternoon, June carved another line into the post behind the stable, just beneath the one that had stood for weeks. "Belonging doesn't need a blood name." Elijah saw it. He didn't change a thing, because to him she wasn't someone he had taken in. She was the one who had chosen to stay when no one had asked, no one had bargained, and no one had bought. Years later, in a small town north of Santa Fe, there stood a white-walled house with a low roof and a cedar rocking chair on the porch that creaked softly in the afternoon wind. Inside, a young woman with her hair tied back sat mending a boy's shirt. The child, about 7, thin, with deep brown eyes, was coloring with wax crayons on a wrinkled piece of paper. He chose a dark red. He drew a man in a wide-brimmed hat, standing in a field, holding a lantern. Behind him, a small girl with a pistol in her hand, not to shoot, but to stand tall. June was grown now, but there was still a hush in her gaze, the kind of quiet that lives in people who once survived long nights and don't need anyone to clap when they walk into the light. The boy didn't bear her name. He was the son of a woman who died giving birth the winter before. June had been there, held him before he could cry his first sound. There were no papers, no lineage, just this. Someone had once kept her, so now she knew how not to leave. One night, near the wood stove's fading glow, the boy asked, "Mama, did you have a father once?" June paused. She smiled, looking at the small scratch on his hand, a tiny mark, but it pulled her back across the long road she'd walked to get here. She began to tell it, not in order, not with names, and not as a tragedy. I was left once, she said, in a place where wind slipped through wooden walls and silence stretched so long I thought nobody remembered how my voice sounded. But then there was a man. He didn't ask who I was, and he didn't tell me who to be. He just let me stay. He made tea, set out an extra chair, never asked, never locked the door. The boy was quiet. His eyes drifted past the wall, out into the dark yard, where the wind still moved, but no longer carried the cold it once had. So, was he my grandpa? He asked. June bent down, tied the lace he'd just pulled loose. No, she said. He wasn't your grandpa, but you don't have to share blood to be called family. She placed her hand on his head, pressed her cheek gently into his hair. It wasn't in a parenting book. It was only in the memory of a child who had once been kept, with warm tea, cornbread, and a nod that never needed a name. She told the story only once. No one else ever heard it. But each spring she would take out an old wool scarf, stitch its frayed edge, and burn a single stick of incense behind the house, not for ritual, but as a way of telling the earth one small kindness, once given, had quietly bloomed. The old timber cabin still leaned into the hillside, facing west, same as the day Elijah first built it. The roof had been replaced more than once, but the smoke still rose through the same chimney path, a thread-thin line in the sky, just enough to let anyone down below know someone still breathed up here. No one remembered the year Elijah passed. He left no will, no kin, only June, now past 30, who came back with the changing wind each spring. That day she brought her son. He was older now, longer hair, deeper eyes, the same quiet look she had when she was 13. The cabin still stood as if no one had ever left. But on the porch, there were 2 chairs, one tall, one short. The old one had been sanded smooth. The new one was painted with a color she mixed herself, pale brown. She brewed tea, placed 2 cups on the table, one large, cracked at the rim, one small, the steam rising faintly from the lip. The wind moved through, carrying the scent of scorched cornbread, wood smoke, and something older, the faint trace of saddle leather. June opened the door. The kitchen was unchanged. The wood around the handle was blackened with time. The salt jar was half full. The iron spoon she once held at 13 still hung from a hook. Above the stove, a small pair of wool gloves still hung, worn but never torn. She didn't cry, didn't smile. She lit the oil lamp, a simple flame, as if calling out to someone who hadn't returned in years and wouldn't, but who, somehow, was still being waited for. The boy sat in the smaller chair. He asked, soft, "Mama, did you used to sit here?" June nodded, then looked out over the field, where hooves once paused, where drunken voices once shouted, where a girl once stood trembling in the dark. "And he always kept an empty chair," she said, "in case someone needed a place to sit." That evening she carved into the doorframe, "For anyone ever left behind, this place isn't finished yet." Not for others to read, but for herself. To remember that sometimes a single chair set beside another was all someone needed to not go on alone. The sunset wind rose. The boy fell asleep in her arms. On the table, Elijah's cup still held warmth, not by miracle, but because someone had poured it with her own hands, for someone no longer there, and that was enough. A man had once chosen to keep a child. A child had once carved her name into a post. A door had once remained unlocked, and a sentence never repeated had once been spoken. She doesn't have to go anymore. The story closes like a door never latched. Anyone may step in if no one has opened it yet.